Okay, let's jump right in. We're talking about the basics of how the U.S. government is set up.
Right. And at its heart, it's really about understanding a few key principles. These ideas are all about organizing government power, but also, importantly, limiting it.
Preventing anyone from getting too much control.
Exactly. It's designed to distribute power. And you really see three big ideas running through it: federalism, separation of powers, and checks and balances.
Okay. And the most obvious structure is that three-branch system, right?
That's the framework, yeah. Three co-equal branches making up the federal government.
So power is divided horizontally, right there at the national level.
Precisely. Let's start with the legislative branch. That's Congress. Article 1 of the Constitution lays this out.
And their main job is making the laws.
Yep. That's the core function, lawmaking.
And Congress isn't just one big group, is it?
No, it's bicameral,
Yeah.
meaning two chambers. You've got the House of Representatives.
Okay, the House. How many folks are in there?
435 voting members.
Yeah.
And representation is based on state population. They serve 2-year terms.
2 years. So they have to stay pretty tuned in to public opinion back home.
Generally, yes. They're seen as being closer to the people's immediate concerns. Then you have the Senate.
Right, the Senate. Different setup there.
Totally different. 100 members. 2 from each state. Doesn't matter how big or small the state is.
So Wyoming gets the same number of senators as California.
Exactly. And they serve 6-year terms, but they're staggered. So only about a third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years.
Provides more continuity maybe, less subject to rapid shifts in mood.
Yeah, that's the idea behind it. It was a major compromise at the founding, balancing representation by population with equal representation for the states.
And they have distinct jobs, the House and Senate.
They do. Some unique powers. The House, for instance, has the power of the purse.
Meaning?
All bills for raising revenue tax bills have to start in the House. They also have the sole power of impeachment.
So they're the ones who formally accuse a federal official, like the president.
Exactly. The House impeaches, which is like bringing charges.
Okay, so if the House brings charges, what happens next?
Then it goes over to the Senate. The Senate conducts the trial.
So they act like the court in that case.
Pretty much. And it takes a 2/3 vote in the Senate to actually remove someone from office. The Senate also has the crucial advice and consent role.
Right. I've heard that phrase. What does it cover?
Major presidential appointments, cabinet secretaries, ambassadors, federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. The Senate has to confirm them. Plus, they ratify treaties negotiated by the president, again by a 2/3 vote.
A lot of power there. And the VP is involved somehow.
Yeah, the vice president is technically the president of the Senate, but they only get to vote if there's a tie.
Okay. So Congress makes the laws. Who actually carries them out?
That would be the executive branch. Article 2, headed up by the president.
Right. The president's job is basically enforcing and implementing those laws Congress passes.
That's the primary function, yes.
And the president wears a lot of hats, right?
Oh, absolutely. Head of state, the symbolic leader, and head of government, the chief executive running the administration. 4-year term, and thanks to the 22nd Amendment, limited to 2 terms.
What are the big powers?
Well, commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Negotiating treaties, though, the Senate has to approve them. Appointing key officials again with Senate confirmation. Granting pardons for federal offenses. And a really significant one, the power to veto legislation from Congress.
But Congress can push back on a veto, can't they?
They can. They can override a presidential veto, but it's tough. Needs a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate.
Wow, 2/3 in both. Doesn't happen every day, I imagine.
No, it's a high hurdle. And the vice president. Besides being first in the line of succession and presiding over the Senate, they're usually a key advisor.
And executive branch is more than just the president and VP, obviously. It's huge.
It's enormous. You have the cabinet, you have the heads of the 15 main executive departments, like state, treasury, defense, then countless executive agencies.
Like the EPA or NASA.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
The Environmental Protection Agency, CIA, FBI, Food and Drug Administration. The list goes on. These agencies and the millions of civilian employees making up the federal bureaucracy do the actual work of implementing laws, running programs, and creating regulations.
Regulations, so they fill in the details of the laws.
Right. Congress might pass a broad law about clean air, but it's the EPA that writes the specific rules about emissions standards for factories. That rulemaking power gives them a lot of influence.
Okay, so we have the legislative making laws, the executive implementing them. What's the third branch?
That's the judicial branch, Article 3. This is the federal court system. Their main job is interpreting the laws and, crucially, ensuring they line up with the Constitution.
Interpreting and checking constitutionality, how's it structured?
It's a hierarchy. At the top, the Supreme Court. One Chief Justice, currently 8 Associate Justices. They're the final word on federal law and the Constitution. Most cases they hear come up through appeals from lower courts.
And what are those lower courts?
Below the Supreme Court are the U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals. There are 13 circuits covering different regions of the country. They review decisions from the trial courts.
Review, not retry.
Correct. They don't hear new evidence or witnesses. They look at the record from the trial court to see if the law was applied correctly, if there were legal errors.
Okay, so where do cases actually begin in the federal system?
They start in the U.S. district courts. These are the main trial courts. There are 94 districts across the country, at least one in every state. This is where trials happen, evidence is presented, juries deliberate, and initial rulings are made.
And the judges in all these federal courts, how do they get their jobs?
Federal judges are nominated by the president, but they have to be confirmed by a majority vote in the Senate.
Ah, another check.
Yes. And once confirmed, they serve for life technically, during good behavior.
Life tenure, why is that?
It's designed to protect judicial independence. The idea is they can make rulings based on the law and the Constitution without fearing political retribution or needing to please voters or politicians. It insulates them from political pressure.
So these three branches, legislative, executive, judicial, are deliberately separate. That's the separation of powers idea.
That's it. Keep the core functions distinct to prevent concentrating power. But just separating them isn't quite enough.
Right. You mentioned checks and balances.
Exactly. The framers built in ways for each branch to limit or check the power of the other two.
So they interact and kind of push back on each other.
Yes. It's a system of mutual restraint. Each branch has tools to block or influence the actions of the others. It forces them to cooperate somewhat and makes it harder for any one branch to run away with things. Think of it like a constant tug-of-war designed to keep things in balance.
Okay, let's walk through some examples. How does Congress check the president, the executive?
Congress has some major checks. We mentioned impeachment and removal. Veto override is another big one. The Senate's advice and consent power over appointments and treaties is crucial. And maybe the biggest lever is the power of the purse.
Controlling the money.
Right. The executive branch can't spend any money unless Congress appropriates it. That gives Congress huge influence over what the government actually does.
Makes sense. No money, no action. How about Congress checking the courts?
Well, the Senate confirms all federal judges. Congress can also impeach and remove judges, though it's rare. They can change the structure and jurisdiction of the lower federal courts. And if they really disagree with a Supreme Court interpretation of the Constitution, Congress can propose a constitutional amendment.
Which is hard to do, right?
Very hard. Needs 2/3 of both houses of Congress, then ratification by 3/4 of the states. Congress can also pass laws to modify the impact of some court decisions, as long as it's not about the Constitution itself.
Okay. So Congress has checks on both. How does the president check Congress?
The veto is the most direct check on legislation. Just the threat of a veto can shape bills as they move through Congress. The president can also call Congress into special session, propose legislation, set the agenda through the State of the Union and budget proposals, and use the bully pulpit, their public platform, to pressure lawmakers.
Well, how does the president check the judicial branch?
Primarily through the appointment power. By nominating judges, the president shapes the federal judiciary for potentially decades to come. Also, the president can grant pardons and reprieves for federal crimes, essentially overriding a judicial outcome in specific cases.
Okay, last one. How do the courts check the other two branches?
This is judicial review. It's the power, most famously established in Marbury v. Madison, for courts to declare a law passed by Congress or an action taken by the executive unconstitutional.
And if they declare it unconstitutional?
It's null and void. It can't be enforced. This gives the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, immense power to interpret the Constitution and say what the government can and cannot do.
Oh, and the Chief Justice presides over any presidential impeachment trial in the Senate.
It really sounds like a system designed for friction, almost.
It is, and that friction is intentional. The goal wasn't efficiency above all else. It was preventing tyranny and protecting liberty by dividing power. It forces compromise and accountability, but yeah, it can definitely lead to gridlock and make big changes difficult without broad agreement.
Now, besides this division within the federal government, there's a whole other dimension, Power divided between the national government and the state governments. That's federalism.
Exactly. Federalism is that division of sovereignty between the national level and the state level. Both have their own spheres of authority, and some powers are shared.
What powers belong just to the national government?
The Constitution lists enumerated or expressed powers, mostly in Article 1, Section 8. Things like regulating commerce between the states, coining money, declaring war, running the post office. Then there are implied powers.
Implied? How does that work?
Through the Necessary and Proper Clause. It says Congress can make any laws necessary and proper to carry out its listed powers. The Supreme Court case, McCulloch v. Maryland, strongly affirmed this, giving the national government considerable flexibility.
Okay. And what about the states? What are their powers?
The 10th Amendment covers this. It says any powers the Constitution doesn't specifically give to the national government or deny to the states are reserved for the states or the people. This includes things like setting up local governments, conducting elections, and broad police powers to regulate health, safety, and morals.
Are there things both levels can do?
Yes, those are concurrent powers. Things like taxing, borrowing money, setting up courts, making and enforcing laws. Both federal and state governments can do these things.
But what if state and federal laws clash?
Then the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 kicks in. It says the Constitution and federal laws made under it are the supreme law of the land. So generally, if a valid federal law conflicts with a state law, the federal law wins.
Like the federal laws about marijuana versus states legalizing it?
That's a classic example.
Hmm.
Technically, federal law is supreme, though enforcement is another question. McCulloch v. Maryland was also crucial in establishing this principle early on.
Has this state-federal balance changed over time?
Oh, absolutely. It's been a constant evolution of push and pull. In the beginning, it was about establishing the union and figuring out the balance. Early Supreme Court cases under Chief Justice Marshall, like McCulloch and Gibbons v. Ogden, tended to strengthen national power. But the states' rights idea remained strong and was a major factor leading up to the Civil War.
What happened after the Civil War?
For a long stretch, roughly 1865 to 1937, we often talk about dual federalism. Think of like a layer cake, clearer lines between national and state responsibilities. During this time, the courts often limited the federal government's power to regulate the economy.
And more recently?
Since the New Deal in the 1930s, we've mostly been in an era of cooperative federalism, sometimes called marble cake federalism.
Marble cake.
Yeah, because the layers are all swirled together. National, state, and local governments are much more intertwined, cooperating on programs, sharing funds and responsibilities. Federal power expanded significantly, often driven by national crises like the Great Depression or demands for things like civil rights in the 1960s.
Has there been pushback against that?
Yes, especially in recent decades, there's been a trend called devolution efforts to shift power and responsibility back to the states and local governments. But it's always a dynamic relationship, constantly being renegotiated.
Okay, understanding these structures, the branches, federalism helps explain how government actually gets things done, how policy is made.
Exactly. Public policy is basically the government's response to a problem or issue, what they decide to do, or sometimes what they decide not to do. It's usually a messy, complex process, but we can think about it in stages.
What's the starting point?
It generally starts with agenda setting. This is how problems actually get the government's attention and are seen as something needing action. It's a crowded agenda. Lots of issues are competing for attention.
And who decides what gets attention, what gets on the agenda?
A whole range of actors. Public opinion is huge. If lots of people are worried about something, politicians notice. Interest groups are constantly lobbying, running campaigns, trying to push their issues. Think AARP on issues affecting seniors.
The media plays a role too.
A big one. By deciding what to cover and how to frame it, the media can elevate an issue like, say, the opioid epidemic, making it seem more urgent. You also have policy entrepreneurs, individuals who really champion a cause and focusing events, crises like 9/11 or a major natural disaster that can instantly vault an issue to the top of the agenda.
So once an issue makes it onto the agenda, what's next?
Then you move into policy formulation. This is where potential solutions are developed and debated. Congress and its staff do a lot of this, researching, holding hearings, drafting bills.
Do the executive agencies get involved here too?
Absolutely critical. They have the expertise from dealing with these issues every day. They draft regulations, provide analysis. Think tanks also contribute research and ideas. And interest groups are heavily involved, trying to shape the specific details of the proposed solutions to favor their members.
And the bureaucrats, the people implementing things later, they have input.
Yes, their practical knowledge is vital, and they also exercise discretion later on, interpreting broad laws in specific situations. So those street-level bureaucrats, like police officers or teachers, really shape how policy works in practice.
Okay, so solutions are proposed. How does one get chosen and become official?
That's policy adoption or legitimation. It's the formal approval process. Federally, it usually means a bill passing both the House and Senate in identical form and then getting the president's signature.
Or surviving a veto?
Or surviving the veto, yes. The bipartisan infrastructure law is a recent example of a major policy adoption.
And states have their own processes.
Similar legislative process with the governor signing. But many states also allow citizens to vote directly on laws through initiatives or referendums. California legalizing marijuana via Proposition 54 is a good example of policy adoption through direct democracy. Locally, city councils or school boards vote on ordinances.
Right. So a policy is adopted, then someone has to actually do it.
Policy implementation.
Right.
This is putting the policy into effect. It's primarily an executive function carried out by the bureaucracy, those agencies we talked about. They write the detailed rules, run the programs, deliver the services.
Is implementation straightforward?
Rarely. Challenges pop up all the time. Maybe the law itself was vague, or Congress didn't provide enough money, or the agency just resists the change. Implementing something like the Clean Air Act involves years of complex rulemaking and enforcement by the EPA.
How does federalism play into implementation?
Big time. States implement their own laws, but they also implement many federal laws, often with federal funding and standards, but state-level flexibility. Think about Medicaid. It's a federal program, but states run it differently. Sometimes state goals clash with federal ones. And local governments are on the front lines, implementing policies with often limited resources.
Okay, so policy is implemented. How do we know if it worked?
That's the final stage, policy evaluation. Assessing whether the policy achieved its goals, what its effects were intended and unintended. The idea is to provide feedback to policymakers.
Does evaluation actually lead to changes?
Ideally, yes. Evaluation findings should inform decisions about continuing, changing, or ending a policy, and feedback into future agenda setting and formulation. There's a push for more evidence-based policy using rigorous evaluation data.
But it's not always easy.
No, there can be a disconnect between researchers and policymakers. Politics often intervenes. A policy might continue even if evaluation shows it's ineffective, because it's popular or serves powerful interests. And capacity varies. The federal government generally has more resources for evaluation than state or especially local governments.
Going back to the courts, their power of judicial review has been central to defining rights.
Hugely important. Again, that's the power to declare government actions unconstitutional, making them invalid.
And this power came from Marbury v. Madison.
That's the case, 1803. Chief Justice John Marshall basically asserted the court's authority to interpret the Constitution as the supreme law and strike down laws that conflict with it. It really established the court as a co-equal branch.
Is everyone happy with this power?
Oh, there's constant debate, usually framed as judicial restraint versus judicial activism. Restraint suggests courts should defer to elected officials and precedent. Activism implies courts are maybe too eager to make new policy or find new rights, stepping on the legislature's toes. People tend to accuse courts of activism when they disagree with a ruling.
The civil rights movement is a key area where court decisions had massive impact.
Absolutely pivotal.
Yeah.
You have to remember the context. After Reconstruction failed, the Jim Crow system enforced brutal segregation and denied voting rights to Black Americans. And the Supreme Court, in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, shamefully upheld separate but equal, giving it legal cover. Justice Harlan's dissent was powerful, arguing the Constitution is colorblind, but it was ignored for decades.
So legal segregation was the reality. What changed?
The pressure built, especially after World War II. Black veterans, civil rights organizations like the NAACP using lawsuits, others like SCLC and SNCC using nonviolent protest, they all pushed relentlessly.
What were some of the turning points?
Key Supreme Court cases, like Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, finally overturned Plessy in schools, declaring separate, inherently unequal. Then events like the Montgomery bus boycott, the Little Rock Nine crisis, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the shocking violence in Birmingham shown on TV, the March on Washington, all built overwhelming moral and political pressure.
Which led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yes, a landmark law. President Kennedy proposed it. President Johnson pushed it through after Kennedy's assassination. It faced incredible opposition, especially a massive filibuster in the Senate by Southern Democrats.
A filibuster? That's where they just keep talking to block a vote?
Exactly. It lasted 75 days. Breaking it required invoking cloture, which needed bipartisan support and was unprecedented for a civil rights bill at the time. But they did it.
What were the key parts of the act?
It was broad. I dealt with voting rights. Title II is huge. It outlawed discrimination in public accommodations like hotels and restaurants, effectively ending legal segregation in public life. The court upheld this based on the Commerce Power and Heart of Atlanta Motel.
Interesting use of the Commerce Clause. What else?
Title VI barred discrimination in programs receiving federal funds impacting schools, hospitals. Title VII prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and created the EEOC.
The inclusion of sex was important there.
Hugely. It became the foundation for fighting gender discrimination in the workplace. The 1964 Act was transformative, ending de jure segregation. But of course, the struggle against systemic inequality, de facto segregation, continues. Debates about affirmative action, voting access, policing, even how these laws apply to AI bias or LGBTQ+ rights like in Bostock setting Title VII show it's an ongoing process.
Another fundamental right shaped by the courts is the right to counsel.
A perfect example of selective incorporation applying the Bill of Rights to the states via the 14th Amendment.
So before a certain point, states didn't always have to provide lawyers for poor defendants.
That was the situation under the Betts v. Brady precedent from 1942, only in special circumstances. The Sixth Amendment right to counsel was thought to apply only federally.
What changed that?
The landmark case Gideon v. Wainwright in 1963. Clarence Gideon, representing himself from prison, appealed his conviction. The Supreme Court unanimously overturned Betts. Justice Black famously wrote that lawyers in criminal cases are necessities, not luxuries, and the Sixth Amendment right is fundamental, applying to states through the 14th. States must provide counsel for indigent defendants in felony cases.
A huge win on paper. Has it worked out in practice?
It established the principle, but implementation remains a challenge. States use different systems, public defenders, assigned counsel. The biggest problem today is chronic underfunding. Public defenders often have impossible caseloads, way beyond ABA recommendations.
Which means they can't provide an adequate defense.
That's the concern. Critics talk about meet 'em and plead 'em justice, where overworked lawyers push quick plea bargains. It raises serious questions about whether the constitutional promise of effective counsel is being met for everyone. It shows the gap between legal ideals and fiscal realities.
And courts keep interpreting rights in new contexts all the time.
All the time. Miranda warnings, searches of cell phones, Riley, the right to privacy, Griswold, gun rights, Heller. The courts are constantly grappling with how old principles apply to new technologies and social issues.
Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about political parties and interest groups. How do they fit in?
They're key players influencing the government. Political parties, primarily Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. system. Their main goal is to win elections, control government, and enact their broad policy agendas. They recruit candidates, mobilize voters, organize government structures.
Why just two main parties?
Our winner-take-all election system makes it really hard for third parties to gain a foothold, even though they sometimes raise important issues. Parties are also pretty decentralized. The national, state, and local party organizations can be quite distinct.
And how are interest groups different?
Interest groups don't run candidates for office. Their goal is to influence policy decisions on specific issues they care about. They lobby officials, use PACs and super PACs in elections, file lawsuits, run public campaigns. They could be based on economic interests, public interests, single issues, ideology.
Is there agreement on how much influence they have?
Not really. Pluralist theory suggests lots of competing groups lead to compromise and balance. Elite theory argues a few powerful, well-funded groups dominate the process. The reality is likely somewhere in between and complex.
And all this operates within the context of public opinion.
Absolutely. How people form opinions, the role of partisanship, the degree of polarization, these are all huge factors. And public opinion isn't static. Think about the big shifts in party loyalties, like the South moving from Democrat to Republican largely around civil rights issues.
The government also plays a major role in the economy.
Two main tools. Fiscal policy, that's government taxing and spending decisions, mainly handled by Congress and the president. Think stimulus checks or tax cuts.
And the other?
Monetary policy, managing the money supply and interest rates to influence inflation and employment. That's primarily the job of the Federal Reserve, the Fed, which operates independently.
So when you put it all together, the branches, federalism, the policy process, court decisions shaping rights, political groups, economic levers, It's a really intricate system.
It really is. You have these foundational principles from the 18th century meeting modern challenges. It's built for deliberation, sometimes leading to gridlock, but it's also shown a capacity to adapt over time through amendments, new laws, and evolving interpretations.
It's definitely not static. It's a living system.
Exactly. Understanding American government means understanding that constant interplay between the constitutional framework and the dynamic forces of politics, society, and the economy. It's designed to limit power and protect liberty, but it's always under pressure to act and respond to the needs of the day.
Thinking about that adaptation, especially how the courts interpret a centuries-old constitution and those debates about activism versus restraint we mentioned, here's something for you, the listener, to think about. What do you believe is the right approach for courts when they have to apply those fundamental constitutional principles to the complex issues and rapid changes we see in society today?